The first thing I remember after the accident was someone shouting, "Stay with me." I couldn't open my eyes. I couldn't move. There was a sharp pain somewhere in my chest, the sound of sirens around me, and a paramedic repeatedly telling me that the ambulance was almost at the hospital. I didn't know then that my parents were about to make a decision that would change our relationship forever. According to the police report, another driver had run a red light and hit my car on the driver's side. The impact was so severe that I had to be pulled from the wreckage. I arrived at the hospital unconscious. The doctors discovered internal bleeding and several serious injuries. They immediately took me into emergency surgery. Because my parents were listed as my emergency contacts, the hospital called my mother. A nurse later told me exactly what happened. "Your daughter has been in a serious accident," she said. "She's unconscious and the doctors are operating. We need immediate family here." Mom asked, "Is she going to survive?" The nurse told her they were doing everything possible. Then Mom said something that I would remember for the rest of my life. "We can't come right now." The nurse apparently thought she had misunderstood. "Ma'am, your daughter is in critical condition." Mom sighed. "Her sister needs us more right now." My father was with her. He took the phone and asked one question. "How long will the surgery take?" The nurse told him there was no guarantee. Dad replied, "Call us if anything changes." Then they hung up. They didn't come. Not that afternoon. Not that evening. Not even after the surgeon came out and told the hospital staff that my condition had become dangerously unstable. At 11:40 that night, the doctor called my parents again. This time, he didn't soften the message. "Your daughter may not make it through the night." They still didn't come. I survived because the surgical team refused to give up on me. When I finally woke up, I couldn't remember the accident, but I remembered something else. My mother's voice, not from the hospital, from years earlier. Every time I needed her, she had told me the same thing. "Your sister needs us more." I had always accepted it. That night, lying alone in a hospital room, I finally wondered what if I stopped accepting it. Recovery was nothing like I had imagined. For the first several days, I couldn't stand without help. My ribs were fractured, my left leg was badly injured, and even speaking for more than a few minutes made me exhausted. But the physical pain wasn't what kept me awake. It was the silence. My parents didn't visit. They didn't sit beside my bed. They didn't ask the doctors about my condition. Instead, the hospital kept receiving short phone calls from my mother asking when I would be discharged. The third time she called, the nurse finally asked me whether I wanted to speak with her. I stared at the phone. "No." The nurse nodded and left. That was when I started thinking about my childhood. My sister, Claire, had always been the center of our family. When she had trouble at school, Mom took time off work. When Claire wanted to attend an expensive college, Dad helped pay for it. When she got engaged, my parents paid for the venue. When she had her first baby, Mom practically moved into her house. I had never complained. At least that's what I told myself. I was always described as the responsible daughter, the independent one, the one who could handle things. Whenever I asked for help, Mom would say, "You're strong, Claire needs us more." I had believed that being strong meant needing less. Now I realized something. They hadn't been treating me like the strong daughter. They had been treating me like the daughter who could be ignored without consequences. A week after the accident, the social worker came into my room with paperwork. "We need to update your emergency contacts," she explained, "and the people authorized to receive information about your medical care." I looked at the form. My parents' names were still there. I picked up the pen, then I crossed them out. I replaced them with my best friend, Rachel. Rachel had visited every single day. She brought clean clothes. She spoke to my doctors. She paid for things my insurance didn't cover. Most importantly, she showed up. That afternoon, Rachel sat beside my bed and asked, "Are you sure about this?" I nodded. "I've spent my whole life understanding why they couldn't be there for me." She squeezed my hand. "And now?" I looked toward the window. "Now I'm going to understand what happens when I stop waiting for them." I didn't know it yet, but changing that emergency contact was only the beginning. Because while I was recovering, I discovered something about my parents that made their decision at the hospital look even worse. 2 days later, my doctor told me I could leave the hospital. I wasn't fully recovered, but I was stable enough to continue physical therapy outside. The first question I expected everyone to ask was where I would go. My parents never asked. Rachel did, and she had already found an answer. Her aunt owned a small furnished apartment near my rehabilitation center. It had been empty for months, and she offered to let me stay there until I could manage on my own. I accepted. Before I left the hospital, I asked the nurse one last question. Did my parents ever come? She looked at me carefully. No. Did they call? Yes. What did they ask? She hesitated. They wanted to know when you would be discharged. I nodded. That answer hurt more than I expected. They hadn't even asked whether I could walk. They hadn't asked whether I was in pain. They wanted to know when I would no longer be the hospital's problem. That evening, I moved into the apartment. Rachel helped me unpack. There were no family photographs on the walls, no childhood memories, no reminders of the people who had chosen not to come. For the first time, the quiet felt peaceful instead of lonely. Over the next 3 weeks, I worked through physical therapy. I learned to walk properly again. I started cooking simple meals. I returned to work remotely, and during those weeks, I made several decisions. I changed my emergency contacts. I updated my medical authorization forms. I reviewed my bank accounts. I changed the beneficiaries on my life insurance and retirement accounts. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was simply making sure my future wasn't controlled by people who had already shown me where I stood in theirs. Then, exactly 28 days after the accident, my mother called. I answered, "Where are you?" Her voice sounded irritated rather than worried. "I'm recovering. We came to the hospital today." I was silent. "We went to your room," she continued. "You weren't there." "I was discharged weeks ago." She paused. "We didn't know." I almost laughed. "You didn't know because you never came." Mom became defensive. "We had Claire to deal with." I closed my eyes. There it was again. The same excuse, the same sentence, the same daughter who always needed more. I quietly replied, "I understand." Then I ended the call. The next morning, my parents arrived at the hospital anyway. They had flowers. They expected to find me waiting in the same room. Instead, they opened the door to an empty bed. On the pillow was a sealed envelope with their names on it. Inside was a single page, and at the top I had written 4 words, "You chose her. I chose me." But that wasn't the part that made my parents go pale. At the bottom of the page, I had listed exactly what I had done while they were gone. My parents stood outside my old hospital room, expecting to find me recovering in the same bed. Instead, they found an empty room. Mom looked around in confusion. "Where is she?" The nurse quietly handed her the envelope. Dad opened it. Inside was 1 page. "You told the hospital my sister needed you more. I finally believed you." Mom's hands began shaking. Dad continued reading. I had written that I was safe, recovering, and no longer wanted them listed as my emergency contacts. I also told them that Rachel was now handling my medical information because she had been there when they chose not to be. Then they saw the final paragraph. "You don't get to disappear when I'm dying and return when I'm convenient." Mom started crying. Dad asked the nurse where I had gone. The nurse couldn't give them my new address. My parents left the hospital without seeing me. That evening, Mom called again. I didn't answer. Then she sent a message. "Please let us explain." For years, I had waited for those words. Now that they finally said them, I didn't want to hear them. But the next morning, Dad sent me something that changed my mind. It was a photograph, and I immediately recognized the person standing beside him. It was Claire, my sister, and she was holding something that belonged to me, something my parents had never told me about. The photograph showed Claire standing beside my father outside their house. In her hands was a folder. I knew that folder. It contained the documents for my parents' family property. I called Dad. "Why does Claire have those papers?" He was silent. Then he admitted the truth. Claire had been struggling financially for months. She had debts, credit cards, a failed business. My parents had been helping her secretly. That was why they had chosen her again. They weren't simply helping their daughter. They were trying to protect everything they had already given her. I asked the question that had been bothering me since the accident. "Did you know Claire was in trouble when the hospital called?" Dad hesitated. "Yes." My chest tightened. "So that's why you didn't come?" "We thought she might lose her house." I laughed bitterly. "I might have lost my life." He had no answer. Then he said something unexpected. "Claire asked us not to come." I froze. "She said you would survive." That sentence changed everything. My sister had known I was critically injured. She had still told my parents to stay with her. I ended the call. Then I contacted my lawyer. I wasn't interested in destroying Claire, but I wanted to make sure nobody could ever use my name, money, or property to solve her problems again. The lawyer asked me to send every document I had. I did. The next morning he called. His voice sounded serious. "There's something you need to know about your parents' financial arrangements." My lawyer explained that my parents had recently tried to add my name to a financial agreement connected to Claire's debts. They had planned to use my good credit to refinance one of her loans. I stared at the paperwork. My signature wasn't there yet, but there was a space waiting for it. They had expected me to sign. My lawyer told me I had no obligation to do it, so I refused. Then I asked him to check something else. "Can you find out whether any of my information has already been used?" He spent the afternoon checking. That evening, he called. "Your parents listed you as a potential guarantor." I felt sick. They hadn't asked. They had simply assumed I would help. Just like they had assumed I would forgive them. Just like they had assumed I would always be available. I told my lawyer to send a formal notice, making it clear that I had never agreed to guarantee Claire's debts. Then I changed my financial passwords and froze my credit. For the first time, I felt completely in control of my own life. But there was still one thing I couldn't understand. Why had Claire been so certain that my parents would choose her? The answer came 2 days later. Claire called me herself. She didn't apologize. Instead, she said something that made my blood run cold. "Mom and Dad promised me your house." I went completely silent. My parents had never mentioned giving me anything, but apparently they had been planning to take something from me, and Claire believed it already belonged to her. I called my parents immediately. "Did you promise Claire my house?" Mom went silent. That silence was enough. Dad finally said, "We thought you'd eventually move closer to Rachel. So you decided my house should go to Claire?" It was only an idea. Claire had already been told it was hers. That was the part that hurt most. While I was lying unconscious in a hospital bed, my family had been discussing my future as if I wasn't part of it. I told them I was selling the house. Mom panicked. "You can't do that. It's my house." "But Claire needs somewhere to live." I laughed quietly. "Apparently, everyone needs something from me." Then I told them the truth. I had already contacted a realtor. The house would be sold. The money would be placed in an account only I controlled. Nobody could use it to rescue Claire. Nobody could claim it. Nobody could decide my future for me. Mom started crying. "You're destroying this family." "No, Mom. You did that when the hospital called." I ended the call. 2 weeks later, the house sold. I used part of the money to buy a smaller place near my rehabilitation center. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine. On moving day, Rachel helped me unpack. For the first time, I looked around and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Then my phone rang. It was Claire. She was crying. "My parents can't help me anymore." I looked at the new keys in my hand. "What do you want me to do?" Her answer was simple. "I want you to be my sister again." I stared at the phone. Then I realized she had never asked me to be her sister before. She had only asked me to save her. Claire came to my new house the next afternoon. She looked exhausted. She admitted everything. She knew our parents had been helping her financially for years. She knew about my accident. And yes, she had told them not to come. "I thought you'd survive," she whispered. I stared at her. "That's not an excuse." "I know." She started crying. I was scared they'd stop helping me. I finally understood. Claire had spent years depending on our parents. Our parents had spent years protecting Claire, and I had spent years pretending it didn't hurt. I told her I wouldn't pay her debts. I wouldn't give her my house. And I wouldn't become responsible for choices she had made. She nodded through her tears. Then she surprised me. "I'm sorry. Not for losing money. Not because Mom and Dad had stopped helping her. She apologized for the hospital, for knowing I might die and choosing herself anyway. I didn't forgive her immediately, but I told her she could start fixing things without expecting me to rescue her. She agreed. Months passed. My recovery continued. I returned to work. I started driving again. And slowly, the accident became something I remembered instead of something I lived through every day. Then one afternoon, I received a letter from my father. There were only 3 sentences, but the last one made me cry. "We finally understand what we did. We don't expect you to come back. We only hope one day you'll believe that we're sorry." For the first time, I didn't feel angry. I felt free. A year after the accident, I drove past the hospital where my life had nearly ended. I stopped for a moment. I remembered waking up alone. I remembered the phone calls my parents never made. I remembered the empty bed and the note. But I also remembered Rachel sitting beside me every day. She had never shared my last name. She wasn't related to me, yet she had been there when my family wasn't. That taught me something I will never forget. Family isn't always the people who are supposed to show up. Sometimes it's the people who actually do. Claire eventually paid off most of her debts herself. She moved into a smaller apartment and found a second job. My parents apologized more than once. I accepted their apologies, but I kept my boundaries. They were no longer my emergency contacts. They no longer had access to my finances, and they no longer made decisions about my life. We spoke occasionally. It wasn't the relationship we once had, but it was honest. And honestly, I preferred that. My new home was small, quiet, and completely mine. On the anniversary of the accident, Rachel came over with a cake. We sat on the porch and watched the sunset. She raised her glass. To surviving, I smiled. To choosing who gets to stay. That night, I placed the hospital note in a drawer. I didn't keep it because I was still angry. I kept it because it reminded me of the moment everything changed. The night my parents chose my sister, I thought I had lost my family. I was wrong. I had lost the illusion that they would always be there. And in its place, I found something better. A life where my worth wasn't measured by what I could give other people. A life where I didn't have to beg anyone to show up. And most importantly, a life I finally chose for myself.